got an hour.
We've got an hour. I'll try not to go on for more than about 30, 35 minutes. But if people want to interrupt, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Welcome to you all. Thanks for coming to this extra session, which I have been able to lay on through the generosity of our external examiner, Peter Gill. Welcome, Peter. Thanks very much indeed for us. And welcome to our distance learning students who are able to see this streamed live. The wonders of technology, eh? So Peter, I'm sure will tell you something about himself, but a sage of intelligence, I'll describe him as. Very well published over a long time about intelligence, and we talked about, in the British context as well as internationally. And you know that I've talked to you about the kind of paucity of literature there is around this subject in this country. The whole field heavily dominated by American literature, which of course is a job for all of you, including IDL students, to redress that balance, I hope. So, Pete, can I leave it to you?
Thank you, Adrian. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and nice to hear. The first time I gave a public speech in Portsmouth was so many years ago, I hardly dare remember. It was during a student revolt in Mercantile House over the road, and I think it was about 1968. There you go. Life does go in circles, or something like that. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and I offered to do this to Adrian because, not surprisingly, anybody who's been trying to kind of work in the area of intelligence for some years, I have, has clearly been somewhat overwhelmed in the last couple of years by the product coming from Edward Snowden via various media, and in a sense trying to work out, what this all means, because, and it is an important thing to know about me, unlike, say, Brian and Adrian, I've never been an intelligence insider. Although, as my students used to say to me, they say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, anyway? But I haven't. I've only looked at intelligence purely as an academic, as someone who's trying to research and write about this somewhat curious, interesting field of state operations. So that's where I'm coming from. And obviously there's a broader context in which the notion of surveillance. Now, I suspect you come from a variety of backgrounds in social science and elsewhere, but of course, in more broader social science terms, and the notion of surveillance is a rather central concept within which it seems to me intelligence, in terms of security intelligence, law enforcement intelligence, whatever, is a rather specific subset of that broader surveillance field. And of course, with the Snowden stuff, these two have clearly, the links between them can clearly be seen. What I thought I'd try to do today, and I should say that I'm very happy to be interrupted. If I say something with which you violently disagree or you don't understand, please just stick your hand up, that's fine, we can pause, there's not a lot of you. And I will try and keep my remarks down 35, 40 minutes so that there is some time for questions and discussion afterwards. What I thought I would try and do is look at sort of three different dimensions of this whole issue that's emerged in the last couple of years, in public anyway. Questions of technology, questions of law, and questions of governance. Now, I have to health warning here. A, I'm not particularly clever at contemporary technology. I don't know much of the ins and outs of how a lot of this stuff actually works at the technical level, although I feel I know a bit more than I did 2 years ago before Snowden produced this stuff. Secondly, though, in the old phrase, many of my best friends are lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, and therefore my observations about law might occasionally strike you as somewhat robust, if not bordering on, ignorance. And then thirdly, governance. I suppose my background's in political science or government politics, so that's something I meant to know more about. And indeed, most of my work over the last 20 years or so now has been with this question of the governance of intelligence, the issues of control, and issues of oversight in the interests of democracy and so on. So there I feel on slightly more secure ground. So let's start with a question. The first question is sort of, okay, so what's the problem here? And of course, what the problem is, how you see the problem, as ever, depends on where you sit. coming at it in terms of the problem from the point of view, let's say, of the citizenry, it seems to me what we've been shown in the past couple of years about the degrees of surveillance and the technological capacities seems to be the critical thing we have to do, and I'm sure this is what you will do as people who know more about this than the average person in the street, is we've got to distinguish potential from actuality. Clearly the potential for what is often described as mass surveillance at the moment is frighteningly scary. I mean, it is just enormous. It seems apparently limitless. And the notion that, you know, people can, as Snowden described himself, with a few clicks of a mouse, he can interrogate, you know, the personal information about any individual on the planet, the sort of thing he was saying when he produced his material. Now, of course, the term mass surveillance is not one that is used by people on the inside. People in government, ministers, people from the agencies talking about this, of course, talk about bulk collection. But this clearly has been the major point of contention. If I could sort of cut to the chase here, if we look at the contemporary law in the United Kingdom, RIPA, Regulation Investigate Repairs Act, which currently governs all this stuff. If you look at Section 8, if you haven't done already, and Section 8 is one of the relatively easy sections of RIPA to understand. Other parts of it are completely incomprehensible, I warn you, should you ever try and look at it. It's a distinction between what we might describe as targeted surveillance and bulk collection. And you look at Section 8, subsection 1, 8.4, it shows you the difference of these. And of course, while there's been a great deal of criticism from civil libertarians, including people like myself, of, you know, some of the way in which bulk collection or mass surveillance works, no one's really made any serious critique of the use of surveillance and intelligence for targeted collection on those people against whom there is reason to believe they might be up to bad things. Okay, there's been no argument about that at all. So it is clearly the bulk collection issue that we're looking at. And of course, the two main questions, neither of which I'm going to attempt to answer because they're very much questions for you to answer for yourself, is not only does this amount to an outrageous intrusion on personal privacy, but it's also a more interesting question, which is, does it work? Is there any point to it? And of course, there we have very different answers, and the answers tend to come from people in different countries. I've heard different answers, and also from different areas of intelligence. Most cops will tell you that, well, you know, we can't do it anyway, and anyway, we're not sure it works. You know, we've got enough to do trying to find out intelligence on the people we know about without worrying about the people we might not know about. The view in places like GCHQ and the security service is different. They say, well, yeah, we know about these people and we're interested in targeting them, but what about the unknowns? What about the people we don't yet know about? And here, of course, it's all wrapped up with what I think we might describe as the post-9/11, just the fear, the uncertainty bordering on ignorance, which has led to the sort of changes and the attempts to collect ever more and more information in the hope that it will reveal people you didn't know about who can then be stopped from doing bad things. The second problem technologically, of course, is that of encryption. GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, when it started, when it was first set up in its original form 100 years ago during the First World War, of course, was about two things, and it still is. GCHQ is still about two things. One is protecting government communications of this country, of this government, and secondly, it's breaking the codes and intercepting the communications of other governments. That's always been its dual mandate, and it still is. And the big problem now, of course, is that encryption has moved from being something until about 1990, let's say, that was used by states primarily, to something that all of us use. Any of us can sign up to pretty good privacy and thus encrypt our own emails, and some of you may well do this. Okay? And this is a problem for the agency. This is a problem for police. Okay. Now, what about the law in all this? The main point I would make about law here, and here I speak as a social scientist rather than a lawyer, is that the law in general, but specifically with reference to intelligence matters, is essentially permissive. The law is about empowering police and security and intelligence agencies to gather information. That's what the law is about. Now, I have had sort of arguments about this with officials in the British government, because my line is this: if you look at Ripper, the question if someone quotes a statute to you and they give the date, so Ripper was 2000, okay. Critical question is, why was that statute passed in that year? Why not 1996? Why not 2004? It's a good question to ask about any statute, because it points you then at what the problem was that it sought to deal with. And the problem that Ripper sought to deal with for the British government in 2000 was that at the same time as it came into effect, the Human Rights Act came into effect, which had been passed 2 years earlier. And of course, the Human Rights Act, for the first time, enshrined all this stuff about privacy into English law, common law. And this was a problem for the agencies, because they feared, and including the police particularly, they feared, that every time they now came to court with evidence, they'd be crossing, well, where did you get this evidence from? Was this proportionate? I don't know, So they feared, this kind of interrogation. So the idea of Ripper was essentially to judge-proof policing. Okay? I mean, your tutors here may disagree, but then, no, you say that, no. Okay. It was to judge-proof policing. And what it had to do, you see, now the Human Rights Act came in, it didn't, if you look at it, it didn't stop the police or the security service or GCHQ doing anything they'd done before. It doesn't say anywhere, you can't do anything. What it says is, it must be authorised. It sets up a process for authorisation. So as long as this process of authorisation is carried out, then your actions will pass muster under the Human Rights Act, and should you get there to Strasbourg, before the European Convention, the European Court of Human Rights. So that's what it was all about. Now that's a really important point, I think, in understanding how we got to where we are. So there's a particular point of Ripper that I just want to mention. If you look at the 1994 Intelligence Services Act about GCHQ, there's a long sort of phrase. I won't read it all out, it's very boring. But briefly, the mandate of GCHQ is to monitor, interfere, obtain information from ... including that derived from encrypted material. So the legal mandate of GCHQ is to get material, including from encrypted material. Doesn't tell you how they're going to do it, okay? So you look at Ripper, section 5, and there it refers to, in pursuance of an authorized, a warrant to gain information, it refers to agencies take all such conduct as is necessary. Wow. All such conduct as is necessary. Amazing. So therefore, GCHQ, using its historical skills, of course, has used a variety of techniques. They might ask the CS, the communications security providers, can we have that information, please? Can we have that communications data? And if they're here, they might have power under Ripper to get it. If they're abroad, they might ask nicely about it. And if they're told no, they might go after it in other ways. And we know now, courtesy of Snowden, all the other techniques that are used to hack into the communications between different Google sites, for example, to intercept material and the cables across the Atlantic, under the Atlantic, to modify equipment between the manufacturer and the customer in order to implant malware that can then be activated remotely in order to control and get information. So in other words, they do all of these things, but now this year, courtesy of Snowden, one has to say we now for the first time have a code of practice about how this computer network exploitation or hacking will be done. Okay. Thirdly, governance in terms of the problem. Intelligence oversight, which is, as I say, the thing about which I've spent most of my time thinking, I suppose, in the last 20 years or so, is a very young enterprise. I mean, the whole notion of liberal democracy is that permanent state officials are accountable to other people, they're overseen by committees of parliamentarians, or they're overseen by legal tribunals, they're subject to complaints from citizens, which will then be investigated. I mean, this is a basic core principle of liberal democracy. It did not apply to the intelligence agencies at all, and only slightly weakly. I mean, there was somewhat weakly to police, let's say, but different. So the intelligence agencies themselves at all until 1985. The first breach in the wall, courtesy of the European Court of Human Rights, was when telephone tapping had to be made subject to a statute, the Interception of Communications Act in 1985, which then set up a commissioner, a part-time judge who would look back at the records of warrants about telephone tapping and so on. 1989, the Security Service, or MI5, gets put on the statute book. 1994, GCHQ and MI6. And at the same time, a committee, what was then a committee of Parliament, the Intelligence and Security Committee, was established. So this stuff's only been going for 20, 25 years. It's a very young discipline, and actually, looking comparatively, we find the same story almost everywhere else. Even the United States, which has been probably more in the forefront of this than most places, you're only really looking back to the mid-1970s before there was any serious attempt to oversee intelligence. Now, as far as the UK is concerned, we've had this mix, therefore, for some years now, of a committee of parliamentarians, the ISC, a series of commissioners, one for interception communications, one for the intelligence services, and one called the Office of Surveillance Commissioner, who is mainly concerned with police. And they provide, in the main, some kind of post hoc audit of warrants. Were these warrants obtained lawfully? Was the process correctly carried, the procedure correctly carried out, and so on. And then there's something called the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which consists entirely of lawyers who hear complaints from the public that they have been subject to illegal surveillance, or that, contrary to the Human Rights Act. Now, I think it's fair to say, without going into the detail, that although a number of people, including myself, had been sort of publicly critical of the effectiveness of this system in the UK for a number of years, it's clear that only in sort of post-Snowden has it become generally accepted within the fields of government and so on that, well, yeah, this is an inadequate procedure. I mean, for example, if one looks back at the Committee of Parliament, look at their record on the Iraq, intelligence in relation to Iraq, the question of rendition and the allegations about the involvement of British agencies in rendition, and then indeed about impact of surveillance on privacy, the ISC was clearly not doing a very effective job, and nor was the commissioners. Very interesting, the Interception of Communications Commissioner, who clearly is responsible for the area in which all the Snowden stuff has come out, said absolutely nothing about the significance of bulk collection in any of the reports he wrote over, almost 30 years, until after the Snowden allegations. Oh yeah, well, then there's this. Before that, you read the reports, and all they're talking about is the importance of targeted interception and how the warrants are obtained. And it's all, and so on. So it's very interesting that these people simply didn't see it as part of their job to actually talk about something which for many people was a far greater intrusion on privacy than targeted surveillance. So it's fair to say, therefore, a number of problems in those areas. Now, let's just look a little bit and say, well, okay, so what can be done? We've got a series of problems here. Back to technology firstly. Now, the first point I have to make here is, when I say, is there a problem, is for whom is this all a problem? Was the inadequacy of RIPA to provide proper legal governance of surveillance a problem for the agencies? No, not remotely. They were perfectly happy with RIPA and were cruising along quite contentedly. I'm not saying with every dot and comma, but there was clearly one just got no sense at all. The agencies were saying, oh, we're really worried here. RIPA seems to be out of date. We're not sure RIPA really covers us for all the things we're doing. I mean, there wasn't a hint of that. Why not? Because, as I said, RIPA was written very cleverly in the late 90s to be technology neutral, to cover the developments of the internet that were foreseen even at that time. So although you hear people say now, oh, RIPA's really out of date, as far as the agencies are concerned, it isn't out of date because it let them do whatever they wanted to do if they got authorization. They were perfectly happy with it. But of course, politically, now you have to say, oh, well, of course, it's really out of date, we've got to update it. Okay, and they've had to come on board with that. In terms of technology, what can be done? If, on the other hand, one is a concerned citizen, let's assume we're all concerned citizens sitting here, what can we do if we are concerned about the potential surveillance, let's say, of our email or our text or our interaction with Facebook and so on? Then the answer is simple. You use encryption. I mean, that's not because I'm an expert on this. Watch the interviews with Edward Snowden, who's asked, so what can the individual do? He says, well, use encryption. Okay. And so, of course, there is a problem. The problem for the agencies has now become, technologically, that because of the revelations, the main CSPs, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and all the rest of them, are now, because their customers, us, demand it, are now having to say, oh, well, we've got much better, protection of your communications coming through us. We will protect your privacy much better. And you will have also, whatever you use, you will have had notices from your, whatever you use saying, oh, we're looking after your privacy better now. Do this, do that, and so on and so forth. Because their business model is the same as GCHQ's, is to gather data and to use it. Okay, they use it for different reasons, but that's what they do. It's the same thing. So just as GCHQ wants to say to the government, your communications are safe, the companies want to say to us, the customers, your communications are safe with us. Okay. Now, of course, I think the slight elephant in the room here, and I'll just throw this out, somebody might want to talk about this, and I speak as someone here, at my age who is, okay, I could do an email, I can send a file, I use Microsoft Office, I think I'm pretty clever, but that's about as far as it goes. I don't use social media. I mean, the whole concept, freaks me out. And I cannot believe, stuff that my children, grandchildren, even, what they will do on, the social media. So, I don't go there. But clearly, the use of social media clearly indicates rapidly changing views about what personal privacy means. Okay, to me, with the sort of privacy debates I was brought up on until the sort of, until really the 1990s, the idea that people would actually, put photos of what they're having for breakfast and send them across the internet to anyone who might choose to do it, it just strikes me as bizarre on the extreme, let alone more intimate activities than eating breakfast, but let's not go there. So clearly within this, privacy debate, whereas it used to be cast very much in, there was a state and the state wanted to invade my privacy and I was careful to protect my privacy, clearly that debate now has changed in these two ways. One, by the attitude of individuals who seem now happy to give out all sorts of amazing information about themselves, okay, which you can't then really complain bitterly if someone then says, oh, that's interesting, we'd better have a look at them. But the other big shift here is, of course, the role of the communications providers themselves. Because in security and intelligence terms, a very, very big question, increasingly it seems to me, now is the role of Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and all the rest, and the role that they play vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis us, the citizens / consumers. In other words, we used to see privacy as a relation between state and citizen, and now it's three ways. It's state, companies and citizens, and that's an important complicating factor. What about the law? What can the law do? Well, as any of those of you who, I suspect some of you, have got this kind of practical experience. Some of you may have written out warrant applications for all I know, and if you haven't done already, you probably will in the future at some point. You know that the European Convention on Human Rights insists on this so-called sort of triple lock or triple test before you can get a warrant for interception or intrusive surveillance or whatever authorised. Legality, necessity and proportionality. The actions you propose to take are legal, they are necessary in the context of the particular investigation, and they are proportionate to the information to be gained. But of course, even though that is in the European Convention of Human Rights and therefore in the Human Rights Act, which let's assume that our new government is not successful in its argument that we should come out of that, I would hope. Even if that is the case, of course, that of itself doesn't prevent collection. Because the problem now for the authorities here, the government here, and they are currently drafting a piece of legislation that will replace RIPA and various other pieces of legislation that are relevant to surveillance and so on. And this we are promised later in the autumn. Possibly it might dribble off into next year. But they have, in terms of the emergency legislation they passed last year, the wonderfully named DRIPA, after RIPA came DRIPA, which I love that, the DRIP Act, have guaranteed that new legislation will be required by December 2016. So in the meantime, we've had a number of different reports, and if you're interested in this subject, and if you're, for example, if I offer this out as if you're trying to work out what you're going to do for a dissertation next year, for example, there's 2 or 3 really excellent reports now on this whole area that would be great, source material for quite an interesting dissertation. The Intelligence and Security Committee has done a report which was published in April, and I would say it's probably the least interesting of the 3, because the ISC saw itself, Malcolm Rifkin, the then chair, saw himself as very much a government loyalist and saying, the agency's got these terrible problems, they've got to have all these powers, it's all terrible. And they proposed actually that the law be changed not only to replace RIPA, but also to replace all the laws governing the intelligence agencies into one great big Act of Parliament, and I suspect that is not going to fly. I think the agencies will say, whoa, don't think so. So I don't think that's going to fly at all. The second report was by David Anderson, who is the government counter-terrorism reviewer, and he was tasked to do this report on this whole question. And his report was published earlier this year. May, June, July, sometime in the summer. And it's online, obviously available online, David Anderson, and that is a very interesting report, much more extensive than the ISC's report, much more sort of contemplative about the kind of ethical questions and the privacy question. He didn't see himself clearly as an apparatchik of the government, as I think Rifkin did. It's a fascinating report, gives you a lot of information actually. He's published stuff in there that hadn't previously been published by any of the commissioners or, coming out of the Snowden documents. So that's one I would strongly recommend. And the third one, and this was set up by RUSI, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is an MOD think tank in London. But they were prompted to do this report by Nick Clegg. You remember Nick Clegg? Students' favourite politician of the previous government, who, when Deputy Prime Minister, did speak. Fair enough to Nick. He was on the right. He was on the side of the angels on this issue. He wanted an inquiry done into privacy. RUSI did it, and they had a report, and theirs came out in July. Not as long as Anderson's. I think it's not quite as interesting as Anderson's, but certainly again worth looking at. So you've got some really good, source material there that you could use. So what we are going to get, we know, is a law clarifying, updating RIPA. And so it'll be very interesting to see what the government comes up with, and there should be a draft sometime this year. Now finally, what does this all mean for governance? Seems to me critical. This is the problem for the government in drafting this legislation. As you will know, one of the core problems for governments in running intelligence services or for police, doing intelligence, is secrecy. It's the issue of secrecy around sources and methods, and one might add, international cooperation. These are the kind of crown jewels. These are the things agencies and cops will go to the wall for, in theory, before they will reveal. So the problem you've got, if you are saying, okay, in the interests of democracy, we must write a piece of legislation which is clear and explains with some degree of certainty all the rule of law criteria what intelligence agencies are going to do. How can you do that without giving away sources and methods? Interesting drafting conundrum for people currently sitting up in the Home Office. So I await with interest. I'm glad they're doing it, not me. We await with interest what will happen. But what I would say to you is what we can absolutely guarantee is that this new law will seek to ensure that GCHQ, particularly, can carry on doing all the stuff it does now. I will be absolutely flabbergasted if there is anything in there which says, oh, well, we don't think GCHQ should do this or do that. They won't go there. So their task, therefore, will be to how to maintain it. And therefore, for us as concerned citizens, the key issues are control and oversight. Who is going to control the authorisation of the continuation of these extensive information collecting methods, and who is going to oversee it? I'll just make a couple of points on oversight and then I'll shut up and we can throw this out. As I suggested a few moments ago, the external oversight of intelligence in the UK is clearly shown to be inadequate. The Committee of Parliament, the ISC, the Commissioners, the Tribunal, put it all together. It's provided us with more information than we had before. It hasn't been a complete waste of time, but it wasn't very effective. So that has clearly got to be improved. Of the 3 reports published this year that I mentioned, the ISC, rather typically and predictably, said, oh, well, oversight's kind of okay. We've got an enhanced powers as a committee. We do a pretty good job. Commissioners do a pretty good job. And they kind of skated over oversight. And in terms of control, they didn't recommend much there. They considered the idea that control of authorisation should be up to judges rather than ministers. This is an area of debate. Currently, warrants for surveillance, almost all of them, some exceptions, are provided by ministers. In many countries, it will be a judge. So there is an argument here, and it's made, for example, strongly by Liberty and other civil libertarians, is these decisions should not be made by ministers who are political. They should be made by judges who are independent. Okay, and that debate goes on. Now, interestingly, both Anderson and the Rusi reports indeed go down that route. And they say, okay, one of the changes should be that authorisation will be by judges and not ministers. Although the Rusi, rather cleverly, I think, suggests that they will both have a role. And I think that may happen. That may happen. But the issue is clearly this. The government do not want judges involved. Part of their argument is a legitimate one. They say, okay, well, judges, they're fine people, but they don't always know much about security. They don't understand all the ins and outs here. And if the operation that has been authorised goes belly up, then it's going to be the minister who has to stand up in Parliament and defend it. Judges don't. They are literally, in that sense, they are irresponsible in that sense. So I say, therefore, it's best if we keep ministers as responsible for these authorisations than judges. I have some sympathy with that argument. The other argument where I have some difficulty is the one that it will inevitably be better if judges do it than ministers do it. I don't kind of buy that necessarily. I mean, I know lawyers are highly respectful of judges, but if one looks at their record in cases where, you know, issues of security intelligence come up, they're not always exactly sort of civil libertarians. They may be just as anxious to please the executive, and say, well, we've got to protect national security. Yeah, of course we have, you know. They're not necessarily going to make much difference to the disposition of applications for warrants, I don't think, than judges. So that's one to watch. But where I think there is an important role, important issue is this. Where I disagree with Anderson, although he says that the existing commissioners should all be put together in a more single, more effective body, he wants the judicial commissioners there to be involved both in the authorisation of warrants and then in the oversight of intelligence operations on the basis of those warrants. I think that's a mistake. I think there is clearly a danger there of a potential conflict of interest. And I think here RUSI, who make a similar suggestion to make a single body containing all the commissioners, I think they've got it better, because they are saying there, okay, you keep commissioners over here to authorise the warrants, but these are quite separate from what they call the National Intelligence and Surveillance Office, which is carrying out more effective oversight than we've got at the moment. My final point is this. I've been talking very much about state institutions and so on, and I think it's very important to emphasise that when we look at intelligence oversight everywhere, there's a very important role for what we might more broadly call civil society, for think tanks, for pressure groups, for the civil libertarian groups and so on, for the media. And because if we look at the way in which oversight goes on, we find that the institutions can all, because they're relatively small and know each other rather well, can all start forming a rather cosy relationships between people where nobody really wants to kick the tables over and have a row. And so the role of groups such as Liberty, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, groups of lawyers such as Reprieve, who've done such amazing work around the rendition scandal, these kind of organisations also have got to be supported and encouraged in the work that they do, because of course at the end of the day, even whatever fresh legislation we're going to get, oversight will remain a real struggle because of still the significant power of secrecy around sources and methods. Okay, I'll shut up there. And
thank you, Peter.
Questions?
Any questions?
What would you say your opinion is on Snowden's motivations behind saying what he said, especially about going internally first?
About what, sorry?
Snowden's motivations.
First. His whistleblowing was straight to the point. What would be your opinions on him not going internally first, but going straight to the whistleblower?
Well, I can tell you what Snowden said in answer when he was asked that question. And I'm trying to remember the names of the people concerned. There were two or three. Okay, Snowden, remember, had worked briefly for the CIA, he had worked briefly for the NSA, but when he actually did what he did and sort of downloaded all this stuff and scooted off, he was actually working for Booz Allen, who are one of the big, private companies contracted by NSA. Okay. There are two cases, I don't know, I know Adrian and Brian might remember the names of these people, but I'm trying to remember. In the last 10 or 15 years, a couple of cases of people, similarly NSA employees, who became very concerned about what they saw similarly as the extent of surveillance. And in one case, they went internally, got nowhere. They then went to their member of Congress, who then raised it with the Intelligence Committee, and they didn't want to deal with it. And so in the end, he also, if his name comes to me, I'll tell you what it is. He also then blew the whistle, and then, the skies descended on him, and I think, he got banged up. Then, of course, there was Bradley Manning's, experience, which is a rather different one. But Snowden did produce two or three examples where he said of people who had tried to go the internal route and have been completely unsuccessful. I have some sympathy with that because You know, if you were at GCHQ and you were concerned about the fact that, you know, you were, I don't know, intercepting Angela Merkel's phone, I mean, you went, oh, I'm not sure we should be doing this, you know, they're going to think, well, perhaps you shouldn't be working here. You know, I mean, you know, it's just so contrary to things. So that's it. I don't in my view on whether he did the right thing. I think clearly it's a very difficult question to answer. Was he a traitor? No, because he didn't give the information out to a foreign power. He made the information available. He was very careful to whom he made the information available. There is the argument, of course, well, if he's sitting in Moscow, you know, it must be the case that, you know, the FSB has got it, but his argument is, well, yeah, but he didn't take it with him, so he hasn't got any, you know, he hasn't been in physical possession of the stuff since he went there. I think one would have to say he was very careful, and of course he didn't just stick it out all on the internet, which is what WikiLeaks tended to do. So in that sense, I think you could say he acted responsibly. One of the interesting things about Snowden is that his politics actually are fairly conservative, fairly right-wing. In other words, the guy's not a raving lefty. And of course, one of the interesting things about, this is about American politics, is of course that you get people who are would be considered here very, very right-wing, but who are also highly civil libertarian. So he was probably a Republican by instinct, who generally was very concerned about what he saw as the overwhelming intrusion. One criticism I would make is this. He says his concern was not with American national security, his concern was with the excessive surveillance of Americans. In which case you could argue, well, in that case, why wasn't he more selective so that the stuff that he took out and then released was all the stuff relating to excessive surveillance by the American state of American citizens? Because that's not what he did. I mean, he just downloaded loads and loads of stuff. You know, because if that had been the case, we wouldn't have heard anything about GCHQ. Why would we? You know, so, you know, one can critique him, but then, of course, I suppose there comes a point was, you know, how much time do you really want to sit at your computer downloading this stuff when at any moment you may get caught? I mean, that may be a bit of an unsatisfactory answer, but I think in general, whistleblowing is critical to intelligence oversight. Internal people hate it, and some whistleblowers aren't well motivated, but it can be really important, really important. Brian?
Yeah, I just follow up from that. I think William Binney was the...
Binney, thank you. That's one of the guys.
The same philosophy
Yeah,
that
that's
Binney
it.
had, that Snowden adopted.
Yeah,
You're saying that.
yeah.
Binney, I think, on my limited reading,
Yeah,
Binney's view is about the excessive surveillance of the citizen, which obviously
Yeah.
Snowden, I would suggest, adopted civil
yeah,
philosophy.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
Binney,
Binney was certainly one. There was another one. Thank you for that, Brian. Yeah, yeah. William Binney. Yeah.
Well, I watched for the second time recently the Panorama,
Yeah.
and
What, Peter Taylor's interview with?
that's it,
Yeah.
which I thought was very, very enlightening. It seems that Edward Snowden's an ordinary sort of guy who could be any citizen on any street, and from what I could see, apart from what David Anderson calls shining a light, excuse me, I've got a frog in the throat, on the interception of all this information, Snowden seemed most upset about the Smurfs, where people could literally get into every smartphone on every street globally
Yeah.
and snoop. And
Yeah.
they've had names for them. There's the dreamy Smurfs,
Yeah.
the nosy Smurf,
Yeah.
and the tracker Smurf.
Yeah.
Apart from what the damage that Anderson calls short term, he shone a light on a huge global
Yeah.
problem that will now throw it all out, hopefully, into the marketplace, as it were,
Yeah.
for people to discuss and then do something about.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
And I think that was probably, but initially, I get the feeling that Edward Snowden was just outraged at the snoopers.
I think you're right. I think he was. Again, I think he was. Again, I suppose I'd be mildly critical of the fact that when I, also watched that interview, and I don't know, there was the documentary made. Came out some time ago, wasn't it? The name which escapes me. Sorry. Some of you have probably seen that. The one that Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, made, that was in cinemas. Citizen 4. That's it. Thank you, Adrian. And is this thing I started off with really about the potentiality and the actuality of it? I mean, to me, one of the critical things here is, if you try and get your head around the numbers of communications that are being intercepted here, and do read Anderson, because he provides great detail of this, what is actually been intercepted here. And of course, GCHQ has the capacity to gather a lot of information. But even there, it disregards X percent, of what's flowing around the cables through Bude and off, across the Atlantic. Anyway, of the rest, then most of it is immediately screened out, because it doesn't meet any. But then they've got all these selectors. According to the Snowden documents, perhaps 10,000, 20,000 selectors, which are the things under the 8.4 warrants. Okay, so these are the key words that are looking for and will flag up a communication potentially for analysis. But then, if that's going to throw up far more, how big's GCHQ? Oh God, I should know the answer to this question. 5,000 people, 5,000 or 6,000 people. Some of whom are mathematicians, some of whom are linguists, and some of whom are analysts. How many communications can 2,000 people read and digest in a day? Now people say, oh yeah, but it's all done by algorithms now, by clever algorithms. Well, yes it is, up to a point. But they've got to be written by people. But then they will still throw up so much stuff that at the end of the day, an algorithm will not yet, order a surveillance operation, or God forbid, a drone strike in Syria or Iraq or something like that. A human being's got to sit there, read this, one would like to think, consider it, put it together with other stuff, make a determination, go to a manager, what do you think about that? How many different bits of information can you do that with in a day? It's going to be, compared with the totality of this stuff, it's got to be infinitesimal. See, that's the slight problem I have, Years ago, I don't know if you remember this, there's a film, Enemy of the State, Gene Hackman, and is it Will Smith? Will Smith is the victim. And it was very good. It was very early. This was in the 1990s, you see, and it shows the potential even then. What happens if surveillance is targeted on an individual? Yeah? Oh, you've had your name thing. Turn it around so I can see your name. Thank you. So if Jack Reed becomes a subject of this, right, and all of these resources are turned upon her, okay, smartphone if she uses it, social media if she uses it, email if she uses it, where she lives, private data, bank financial data, quickly accessible, Adrian will tell you how to get that stuff, all of this stuff, and within a very short space of time, we wouldn't, or the person would know everything tonight. We know where she's living, who she's living with, who she's communicating with, what she's saying, what she's doing tonight. We would know everything about her. There's no doubt that potentiality is enormous and is truly, in this sort of 1984 sense, truly Orwellian. But how many different people can you do that with at a time? So when it doesn't work, killing of Lee Rigby, the Charlie Hebdo case, where there are intelligence failures, we discover these weren't people who were, like you, completely innocent and unknown, no one had ever heard of, outside your immediate family and friends, that is. But these are people who had been on the radar. But there still wasn't the resources to do anything about, the surveillance of the people who then subsequently killed them. Because, take MI5, they reckon perhaps 2,000 people they're seriously worried about. And then they will add probably as many again we don't know about. And how many of those are subject to 24-hour surveillance? 20, 40, 50, perhaps, I would guess. I'm guessing. It's a small number there. So why on earth would these people, bar you know, a breakdown or some vindictiveness because they've fallen out with a partner or something like, why on earth are they going to sit there and idly trawl, oh, let's have a look at, oh, you know, this Jack Williams looks like an interesting woman, has an interesting life, oh yeah, let's have a poke round her. I mean, you know, why would they? Apart from the fact it's outrageously illegal, they get sacked if they did it. What's the point? I saw a reference, in the case of NSA, and of course the Inspectors General, which are kind of internal oversight in the States, I think I'm right in saying between about 10 years, about 2003 through 2013, I think a response to a congressional inquiry, I think there were about 12 or 13 cases in which the Inspector General carried out investigation and found cases where individual people within NSA had abused the whole mechanism for sort of personal reasons and were, you know, disciplined or thrown out. Okay, they may not have got every case, but that's an organisation with 20,000 people in it. I mean, you know, that's not a massive, you know, that's not a kind of a massive. I bet University of Portsmouth has got a higher degree of employee malfeasance than that. I perish the thought.
Present company expected.
Present company accepted, of course. I don't know, yeah.
I read somewhere that Facebook deals with 1 billion communications a day globally.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How can you possibly police that?
Well, and yet, very interesting, you see, in the killing of Lee Rigby, where they got fingered, not directly by the ISC, but, you know, it came out, that, oh, well, says Rigby, no, well, if they'd let us know about that communication from Adabawali, you know, it could have been stopped. I mean, that was rubbish. I mean, that I thought was rubbish. I mean, that was an attempt to sort of divert any blame away from the agencies. I don't particularly blame the security service for that, but that was clearly an attempt to deflect blame around the government's agenda of saying, you've got to make even more of this information available to us. Give us everything, give us everything. You know, Facebook saying, well, why should we? We're not security. And then, you know, but then the example occurs to me. So how does Facebook distinguish between two people who might be planning to kill somebody and two people who are playing, what's that popular? Call of Duty 3. Oh, I really want to kill a soldier. Oh, yeah. I mean, how Facebook made a distinguish between that? Brian?
Pete, I think the issue for me, and you talk about the actuality, it's very much focused on Western democracy, but
Yeah.
the realisation that other states, China, Russia,
Yeah.
have also got the same capability.
Oh, yeah.
But the debate isn't there for them, nor realistically should it be. But do you not think there's a wider global debate to be had? You know, very much is focused on Western democracy, US and the UK
Yeah.
particularly, but also no real focus on other states in terms of their capability to do exactly the same activity as we in the States are doing.
Yeah. You've got to be a large, wealthy state to afford the kind of paraphernalia that NSA and GCHQ have. I mean, you know, there aren't that many can do it on that global scale. That's one thing. But the impact, of course, in terms of domestic security intelligence of many other states carrying out routine surveillance via accessing the internet. And here, I mean, there are some companies making a lot of money out of this. There's a company called Finfisher, for example, based in Germany, that sells a lot of gear to extremely nasty regimes everywhere, which is then used for domestic surveillance. And a lot of this was crucial in places, well, it still is crucial in places in the Middle East, for example. And I mean, okay, this is on a different scale because this isn't intercepting the internet globally. This is very much locally based stuff that they're doing. There is a global debate going on. I mean, there is a United Nations resolution. I think I mentioned it. I've got a note here. 2013, after Snowden published, there was a resolution at the UN that was sponsored by Brazil and Germany, I think, which argued that people should be have the same rights, privacy rights online as they have offline, which is lovely. I mean, it's lovely. It's a lovely piece of rhetoric, you know, but not sure how they can bring that. The Council of Europe also, the Council of Europe, which is the overseeing body of the European Convention of Human Rights, they've also argued that there is a need for a kind of intelligence code of practice. Now, there is an accepted code of practice for policing, you know, across all of Europe, across the Council of Europe, but I'm not sure whether this one has been accepted for intelligence. But as you can imagine, if you read it, it's at such a level of generality, you couldn't possibly disagree with it on the one hand. On the other hand, you think it's essentially unenforceable. It's a code of practice. Nobody's going to enforce it. It relies on individual countries' intelligence services adopting it. Well, I suspect there'll be some people here who'd be saying, sorry, you know, it'd be really nice, you know, but we deal with some really nasty people and we just can't do that. But they will then say, you know, but everything we do is legal, or will be with the new act. So there is that global debate, Brian, at a high level of generality, though. But, you know, it's the old thing, isn't it? There's no world state, so who's going to enforce any agreements over intelligence? And I think there's a massive difference, which is relevant, I think, for a lot of people here, between intelligence on the one hand and law enforcement on the other. A lot of the debate in Europe about this thing about, you know, Europe as a safe harbour for data and all this kind of thing for citizens' data, a lot of this clearly relates directly to law enforcement, because law enforcement is relatively transparent because it ends up in court action and prosecution and stuff like that, or some of it does. And so, you know, issues around data protection can be applied to law enforcement, but in ways which you just cannot apply it to intelligence, because most of it doesn't result in action. And if it does result in action, people may not end up in court, they'll probably, you know, wind up dead somewhere, or disappeared, or something like that. So we are talking about very different fields. I think there's a possibility, there's some slow movement towards improving privacy with respect to law enforcement. It will just make the life of cops much harder, of course, because there'll be even more restrictions on how you get warrants and stuff like that. But with the intelligence, no, ain't going to happen. Ain't going to happen.
Just thinking,
in my humble opinion.
Just thinking ahead then, I infer from what some of the things you said, that the new bill, the new act, actually substantially won't have very much more power than what we already have in real terms, in terms of influencing the work of the agencies and law enforcement. Or maybe law enforcement more than the agencies.
I think probably what they'll have to do, they'll have to be more specific about aspects of method, I think. But you see, as soon as you do that, then you've got the problem. The thing then becomes out of date, because people in the Home Office don't know any more than you or I do about what's going to be, what the kind of developers of computers are going to do in the next 10 years. I mean, we're moving to the Internet of Things. You know, your fridge is going to order your milk for you, I am told. You know, I think, bloody hell. So it's all, you know, law always lags behind technology. Yeah, law always lags behind technology. So they will be trying to write a law that will last for at least 10 or 15 years. So they won't know any more than we do what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years' time. So I think it will remain in very general. But that's the English practice. English law mainly is fairly general compared with other countries. But my argument, I think, is that they will do everything they can to maintain as much discretion as possible for ministers and agencies. They will have to be more specific. I mean, I'd love to be a fly on the wall at the kind of discussions going on in the Home Office, and they try and write this. You know, fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you very much.
Okay.
For your time and
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.